The courtroom was supposed to be the place where my son's future died, but when the heavy oak doors swung open, I realized the real nightmare was only just beginning. We were caught in the middle of a massive, organized scheme, and the people behind it were willing to bury us to keep their secrets hidden. The courtroom was cold, a clinical, sterile place designed to strip away your humanity until you were nothing more than a case number on a folder. I stood there, clutching my purse so tightly that my knuckles had turned porcelain white. My son, Marcus, sat at the defense table, his head bowed, looking like the child he still was, despite the suit that hung slightly too loose on his narrow shoulders. Across the aisle, Assistant District Attorney Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk plastered on his face like a permanent fixture. He had been belittling us for weeks, acting as if the very air we breathed in his presence was an insult to his prestige. Today was supposed to be the day they hammered the final nail into the coffin of our lives. They were pushing for an enormous duration of incarceration, clinging to the narrative that my son was part of an organized scheme. It was a lie, of course, a desperate attempt by the prosecution to boost their clearance rates by turning a confused teenager into a mastermind. Sterling leaned toward the jury, his voice dripping with condescension as he pointed a manicured finger at me. "And then we have the mother," he chuckled, his eyes scanning the room to ensure the jury caught his mockery. "A woman who clearly turned a blind eye while her son trafficked in packages with substance. It's the classic story of a household built on silence and greed." I felt the blood drain from my face, a wave of nausea rising in my throat. This wasn't just a trial, it was a character assassination. I wanted to scream, to stand up and tell them that Marcus hadn't even been in the city that night, that he was at home helping me with my online classes. But I knew the rules. If I spoke, I'd be held in contempt. If I cried, I'd be labeled emotional and unstable. So I sat there, shivering in my thin blazer, feeling the weight of Sterling's gaze. He stood up, adjusted his silk tie, and began to pace the floor like a predator circling a wounded animal. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice smooth and oily, "given the gravity of the evidence, or rather the lack of cooperation from the defense, it is clear that the accused is hiding behind his mother's apron strings. We are moving for an immediate denial of bail, given the attempt to break his life with a charge of this magnitude. He is a flight risk, he is a danger to the public, and quite frankly, he is a product of an environment that breeds this sort of behavior." The judge, a man who looked as though he hadn't slept in a decade, peered over his spectacles, ready to nod in agreement. It was over. I could see it in the way the court reporter's fingers stopped moving, the way the bailiff shifted his weight. The room had already decided that we were guilty. But then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. It wasn't the sound of a late clerk or a stray spectator. It was the sound of authority. A man in an immaculate navy suit walked in, followed by two stern-faced individuals in dark, pressed jackets. The entire room went still. Sterling stopped his speech mid-sentence, his smirk faltering as he realized he didn't recognize the intruders. The lead man didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the jury. He walked straight toward the front, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. He pulled a device from his pocket, not a phone, but something more official, a secure line that only a handful of people in this state possessed. He tapped the screen, whispered a few words into a headset, and then held the phone out toward the judge. The judge's face shifted from irritation to pure, unadulterated terror in a heartbeat. He signaled for a recess, but the man shook his head. He gestured for the judge to answer. The judge's hand trembled as he picked up the receiver from the bailiff. He listened for a long, agonizing minute. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, his complexion turning an ashen gray. He set the phone down as if it were burning his skin. The silence in the room was deafening. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm. The judge looked at Sterling, then at the man in the suit, and finally his eyes locked onto me. He seemed to shrink in his own chair. "Mr. Sterling," the judge whispered, his voice cracking, "you will sit down immediately."
Sterling blinked, his confusion morphing into an awkward protest.
Your Honor, I don't understand. We are in the middle of— I said sit down, the judge roared, slamming his gavel so hard that it bounced on the mahogany bench. He looked toward the gallery, then toward the man who had entered. I have just received instructions from the Office of the Internal Security Review. It appears there has been a severe misunderstanding regarding the nature of these proceedings. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at Marcus, who was staring at the man in the suit with wide, disbelieving eyes. As the man turned to walk toward us, he stopped at the defense table, leaned down, and handed me a small, encrypted folder. Mrs. Robinson, he said, his voice barely audible, we need to talk about who really put those packages with substance in your son's locker, and why the prosecution has been working so hard to bury the logs that prove it. The room spun. I looked at the folder, then at Sterling, who had gone entirely white, his hand shaking so violently he had to hide it under the table. What I saw inside that folder turned my stomach, and I realized in that singular, terrifying moment that the trial wasn't about my son's guilt at all. It was about a conspiracy that went all the way to the top. The courtroom felt as if the oxygen had been vacuumed out of it. The air was thick, heavy, and tasted like copper, the metallic tang of pure fear. I opened the folder, my fingers trembling so violently that the pages fluttered against each other. The documents inside were heavily redacted, but the visible stamps, stamped in crimson ink with Confidential Internal Security Review, made it clear that this was no longer a standard criminal case. My eyes darted across the lines of text. There were transcripts of phone calls between someone named Agent V and a burner number that, according to the tracking logs, belonged to the district attorney's own private office. Sterling was standing up, his chair clattering loudly against the floor as he pushed it back. His composure had evaporated entirely, replaced by a frantic, sweating panic. He looked toward the judge, pleading with his eyes, but the judge wouldn't even meet his gaze. The man who had entered the courtroom, the one in the navy suit, didn't move from my side. He remained a silent, imposing shadow, watching the room with eyes that seemed to record everything. "You aren't supposed to have those," Sterling stammered, his voice lacking its earlier arrogant polish. That is property of the state's evidence vault. Those documents were never meant to leave the secure room." "They aren't just documents, Mr. Sterling," the man in the navy suit replied, his voice calm, flat, and chillingly devoid of emotion. "They are the record of your interference. We've been monitoring the organized scheme you've been running for the better part of a year, using petty cases as smokescreens to facilitate the movement of illegal items through the evidence lockers. You weren't prosecuting crime. You were protecting a supply chain." The entire gallery erupted in a low, collective gasp. Reporters, who until a moment ago had been writing about my son's inevitable conviction, were now frantically typing into their phones, their eyes wide with the realization that they were witnessing the collapse of the district's judicial integrity. Marcus grabbed my arm, his grip bruising, his knuckles white. "Mom, what is he saying? Is this about the locker?" I didn't know how to answer. I looked at the papers again and saw a photograph. It was grainy, a surveillance still taken from the back of the school hallway. It showed the school's janitor, a man I had known for years, handing a small, heavy bag to a man in a tailored suit, the same suit Sterling was wearing on the day of the arrest. My stomach turned over. They hadn't just framed my son, they had used him as a mule, placing the bags in his locker, knowing he was a quiet, unassuming kid who wouldn't put up a fight. "Your Honor," the man in the navy suit continued, addressing the judge directly, "I move to vacate the proceedings in their entirety. Furthermore, I request that the defendant be released into my custody for his own protection, as we have reason to believe that the network Sterling is affiliated with has already taken steps to silence potential witnesses." Silence fell over the room again, but this time it was a silence of pure shock. The judge looked down at the desk, his hand hovering over the gavel. He looked terrified. He knew that if he denied this request, he would be painting a target on his own back. He knew that the Internal Security Review wasn't just here to arrest a rogue prosecutor. They were here to clean house. Granted, the judge whispered, the word barely audible. The proceedings are vacated. Defendant is released to the custody of the Internal Security Division. Sterling lunged forward then, his face contorted in a mask of pure, desperate rage. He wasn't acting like a prosecutor anymore. He was acting like a man who knew he was about to spend decades behind bars for his part in the organized group's operations. "You think you've won?" he screamed, his voice cracking, pointing at me. "You think taking me down stops it? You have no idea who you're dealing with. You think you're safe because you're in a courtroom? They're outside. They've been watching this room the entire time." The bailiffs tackled him before he could reach the bench, slamming him into the floor. But his words hung in the air like a death sentence. My heart plummeted. If they were watching us, then leaving this room was going to be the most dangerous thing I had ever done. The man in the navy suit turned to me, his expression grim. "He's not bluffing," he whispered. "We have 3 exits, and all of them are compromised. We aren't going out the front door. We have to go through the underground secure tunnel, but we have to move now." He reached out and took my hand, pulling me toward the side door, with Marcus close behind. As we stepped into the hallway, the lights flickered and died. For a second, the entire building went pitch black. Then, a sharp, metallic clack echoed through the corridor, the sound of a door being forced open from the outside. A red laser dot danced across the white wall in front of us, then shifted, landing directly on the chest of the man guiding us. He pushed us into a small utility closet, his face pale as he pressed his back against the door, drawing his weapon. "Stay down," he hissed, his eyes fixed on the darkness of the hallway. "If they find us here, don't look up. Whatever you do, don't look at them." Through the crack in the door, I saw a shadow emerge from the end of the hall, and then I saw the glint of illegal weapons as 3 figures rounded the corner, their faces hidden behind tactical masks. The darkness of the utility closet was suffocating, thick with the smell of floor wax and the metallic tang of fear that clung to my skin. I pressed my back against the vibrating pipes, wrapping my arms around Marcus, pulling his head into my chest so he wouldn't see the horrors waiting just beyond the threshold. The man from the Internal Security Division, whose name I still didn't know, held his breath, his weapon leveled at the sliver of light coming through the door's crack. We were hunters becoming the hunted, caught in the very building where justice was supposed to be the law of the land. Outside, the tactical boots clicked against the floor, a rhythmic, calculated sound that signaled they weren't in a hurry. They knew we were trapped. They knew exactly how many exits were sealed, and they were savoring the hunt. One of the figures stopped right in front of our closet. My heart was thundering so loudly I was certain they could hear it through the wood. The figure tapped the door frame with the barrel of an illegal weapon, a taunting, slow sound that echoed like a heartbeat. "We know you're in there, counselor," a voice rasped from behind a mask, a voice that sounded like grinding glass. "You took the files, but you forgot one thing. You don't get to leave this building alive." The man in the navy suit didn't flinch. He signaled for us to stay low, his eyes scanning the closet shelves. He grabbed a heavy metal fire extinguisher and held it up, his knuckles white. He was waiting for the door to open. He wasn't going to negotiate. He was going to turn this narrow space into a killing floor. I watched, paralyzed, as the doorknob began to turn. It moved slowly, with agonizing precision, the latch clicking as it slipped out of its catch. The door creaked open just an inch, a sliver of the hallway light spilling in. Suddenly, the man lunged, not forward but sideways. He slammed the heavy fire extinguisher against the outer wall, causing a deafening metallic clang that echoed through the hall like a gunshot. The intruders, startled by the sudden noise and the shadow of movement, reflexively fired into the opposite wall. The sound of high-caliber rounds tearing through the plaster was deafening, the air filled with white dust and debris, blinding everyone in the immediate vicinity. Before the attackers could adjust their aim, the man grabbed us both by the backs of our collars and shoved us toward a floor-level service hatch I hadn't even noticed. "Go! Into the maintenance shafts!" he commanded, his voice sharp with adrenaline. Marcus scrambled inside, his sneakers scraping against the metal vent, and I followed, pushing myself through the dark, cramped space while the sound of gunfire intensified behind us. We crawled through the labyrinth of pipes and wires, the walls shaking with every explosion in the hallway. I didn't dare look back. I just focused on Marcus's feet in front of me, listening to the muffled grunts of the struggle happening just a few yards away. Then, the fighting stopped. The silence that followed was far worse than the noise. No shouting, no boots, no gunfire. Just the steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of a leaky pipe somewhere in the darkness. Is he still there?" Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I reached out to touch Marcus's shoulder to keep him moving, but my hand brushed against something wet and sticky on the vent floor. I pulled my hand back, shaking, and saw a dark smear on my fingertips that even in the dim light looked unmistakably like blood. We reached a junction in the vents, where the path split into two narrow, claustrophobic tunnels. A sliver of light from a flickering fluorescent bulb filtered in from one side, casting long, eerie shadows. From the darkness of the other tunnel, I heard a low, raspy whistle, a tune I recognized from my own childhood, a lullaby my mother used to hum. My blood turned to ice. That wasn't a sound of a secure officer. It was the sound of someone who knew exactly where we were and was mocking us, luring us deeper into the bowels of the building. Marcus grabbed my hand, his grip tight, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He pointed toward the tunnel that led to the basement level, but from the darkness behind us, a voice cut through the silence. It wasn't the voice of the intruders. It was the calm, controlled voice of Sterling, the prosecutor we had supposedly left behind in the courtroom. "You really shouldn't have opened that folder, Mrs. Robinson," he said, his voice echoing through the metal shaft as if he were right next to us. "There are some secrets that aren't meant to be brought into the light. And now, you're going to learn why." He stepped into the narrow tunnel junction, his tie undone, his face smeared with drywall dust, and in his hand, he held not a weapon, but a small black remote. "The building is wired," he whispered, a manic, empty smile spreading across his face. "If I can't have my career, nobody gets to leave this place." He pressed the button, and the floor beneath us suddenly groaned, the heavy metal grating giving way as the entire section of the shaft began to detach from the wall, sending us plummeting into the dark, bottomless sub-basement below. The sensation of falling was brief, a heart-stopping lurch that ended in a jarring, bone-rattling thud against a pile of discarded construction debris. My breath left me in a singular, pained gasp. Dust, thick and suffocating, billowed around us, tasting of ancient concrete and decay. I lay there for a moment, ears ringing, struggling to orient myself in the pitch-black void. "Marcus?" I wheezed, my voice sounding thin and small in the cavernous space. "Marcus, please answer me." "I'm here, Mom," he groaned from a few feet away. I heard him scrambling, the scraping of gravel against his jeans. "I'm hurt, but I think I'm okay." I forced myself to move, fighting the sharp, radiating pain in my shoulder, and crawled toward his voice. When my hand touched his arm, he flinched, but then collapsed into my embrace. We were in the sub-basement, a place the building schematics didn't even show. It was cold, damp, and smelled of stagnant water. Above us, the broken vent hung like a jagged metallic throat, a sliver of distant light filtering down to show us our prison. I looked around, my eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. The room wasn't just a foundation crawl space, it was a staging area. Stacks of wooden crates were lined up against the far wall, emblazoned with industrial markings. I crawled over, my hands trembling as I pried at a loose board. Inside weren't just standard supplies. There were dozens of vacuum-sealed packages with substance, organized and labeled by date and destination. This was the hub. Sterling hadn't been lying. He was deep in the heart of the organized scheme, and we had just dropped directly into the center of their distribution center. "Mom, look," Marcus whispered, pointing toward the corner. My blood ran cold. There was a flickering monitor mounted to a rusted support pillar, and on it, a live feed of the very courtroom we had just fled. We watched in horror as the man in the navy suit, our only hope, was being restrained by his own people. They were stripping him of his badge and weapon, labeling him an unauthorized agent, and dragging him away. The internal security review had been compromised from the inside. The rot went deeper than I could have ever imagined. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, pulling Marcus to his feet. My legs felt like lead, but the adrenaline surging through my veins was the only thing keeping me standing. We moved toward what looked like a service staircase, but the door was locked tight, a heavy, reinforced steel slab with a high-tech keypad. I hammered on it until my knuckles bled, but it didn't budge. We were trapped in a fortress of our own enemy's design. Suddenly, the heavy metal door at the top of the stairwell groaned open. Shafts of harsh, white light sliced through the darkness, blinding us. Heavy boots descended the steps, slow and methodical. There was no doubt who it was. The rhythmic clicking of their footsteps echoed with the same precision I had heard in the hall. They weren't just coming to capture us, they were coming to finalize the cleanup. I scanned the area for a weapon, for anything at all, but found only the heavy crates of evidence. "Hide," I hissed, pushing Marcus behind a pile of concrete rubble. I picked up a heavy metal wrench from the floor, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Whatever happens, stay down. Don't make a sound." I retreated into the shadows of the crates, holding my breath, my entire body coiled like a spring. The footsteps reached the landing. I could see the silhouette of a man, not Sterling this time, but someone larger, more imposing, wearing a tactical vest with no markings. He held a device in his hand that began to beep, a proximity scanner. He was tracking us, finding our heat signatures in the dark. He paused, his head tilting as he moved closer to the crates where Marcus was hidden. He raised his weapon, the silencer attached to the barrel making it look unnaturally long. "I can smell the fear, kid," the man muttered, his voice cold and devoid of life. "It's a shame. You were just a pawn, but you're a pawn that knows too much." He stepped directly toward the rubble. I knew I had one chance. I stepped out from the shadows, swinging the heavy wrench with every ounce of strength I possessed. It connected with the back of his head with a sickening thwack. He staggered, his weapon skittering across the concrete floor, but he didn't fall. He spun around, his eyes blazing with a predatory rage, and lunged for me. I scrambled backward, but he caught my throat, pinning me against the support pillar. His grip was like iron, his face inches from mine. "You're a persistent one," he hissed. He pulled a knife from his belt, the blade glinting in the faint light. Just as he leaned in to deliver the final blow, a massive explosion rocked the foundation. The entire room shuddered, the ceiling groaned, and a section of the wall collapsed inward, sending a deluge of dirt and debris over us. The attacker lost his grip, stumbling back, and for a split second, I saw who was standing in the opening of the newly formed hole. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the internal security. It was a woman in a dark coat, holding a piece of paper I recognized instantly. The original, unredacted, incriminating file that proved Sterling's guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. She looked at me, her eyes hard as diamonds, and said, "I have the broadcast signal. Are you ready to expose them to the entire world?" But before I could answer, a flood of red laser dots appeared on the walls surrounding us, and the sound of heavy artillery filled the basement. We weren't just being hunted anymore. We were under full-scale siege. The ceiling continued to rain concrete dust as the woman, I realized then it was the investigative journalist I had seen on the news months ago, flung the document folder toward me. It landed near my feet, the bright blue label reflecting the harsh strobe of the emergency lights that had flickered to life in the chaos. "The uplink is ready!" she shouted over the roar of the structural collapse. "If you plug this into the server terminal behind that pillar, it bypasses the entire building's firewall. Every single one of their encrypted communications, their bank transfers, and their ties to the organized scheme will go live on every newsfeed in the country. Now!" I didn't hesitate. I shoved the heavy, jagged piece of metal that had been pinning the attacker aside and lunged for the terminal. The man in the tactical vest lunged after me, his face a mask of primal desperation. But Marcus, my boy, who I thought was too scared to move, threw himself at the attacker's legs, bringing him down in a flurry of dust and rage. It was the first time I'd ever seen my son fight back. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was a survivor. I slammed the drive into the terminal and mashed the upload key. A progress bar appeared on the screen, crawling with agonizing slowness. 20%, 40%, 60%. Around us, the walls seemed to be closing in. The tactical squad from upstairs had reached the stairwell, and I could hear the shouting of orders, the heavy thud of shields slamming against the doorway. They were coming to kill the truth, to bury the story beneath the rubble of this building and our bodies with it. "Come on, come on!" I screamed, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. 85%, 95%, 100%. Upload complete. The effect was instantaneous. Every screen in the building, every phone connected to the local network, and every news channel across the state lit up with the files. The sound of sirens began to swell. Not the sirens of the city police, but the wailing of a federal task force that had been waiting for the signal to act. The heavy steel door at the top of the stairs was blown off its hinges, but it wasn't the intruders who walked through. It was an entire tactical unit, the real ones, the federal authorities who had been operating in the shadows, waiting for us to draw the rot into the light. The organized group's soldiers, realizing they had been outmaneuvered, dropped their weapons as the federal officers swarmed the room. Sterling, who had followed his team down, stumbled into the basement, his face pale as he looked at his own phone, seeing his face plastered on every major news outlet in the country. He tried to run, but he didn't get 10 feet before he was tackled and cuffed. The man who had held me at knife point was subdued by 3 officers, his tactical gear no match for the sheer weight of federal authority. It was over. The silence that returned to the basement was profound. A clean, restorative silence that felt like healing. The lead federal agent walked toward me, his face stern but respectful. He held out his hand, and I took it, feeling the solid, unshakable weight of the truth finally taking hold. "Mrs. Robinson," he said, his voice steady, "your son is safe. Everything is over." Weeks later, the city looked different. The banners of the organized scheme had been torn down, and the corruption that had festered in the district attorney's office was being gutted from the foundation up. Marcus was cleared of all charges, his record expunged, and he was finally back home, sleeping soundly for the first time in months. I sat on our porch, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that felt a little brighter, a little safer. The trial of Sterling and his associates would take years, and they were all looking at an enormous duration of incarceration. They would never see the sun outside of those walls again, and the network they built had been dismantled piece by piece. But as I watched the streetlights flicker on, I knew the greatest victory wasn't the legal one. It was the fact that I had stood my ground, that I had protected my son, and that we had survived the darkest storm imaginable. I looked at the small, framed newspaper clipping on the table beside me. The headline read, "Mother's courage freezes the court and exposes the truth." I smiled, took a deep breath of the cool evening air, and for the first time in my life, I didn't fear what tomorrow might bring. We had been tested by fire, and we had come out stronger, standing on the other side of a nightmare that had finally, mercifully, come to an end.